The wind was howling like a banshee when I realized my own children had thrown me away like yesterday's newspaper. There I was, 73 years old, clutching my worn leather purse and watching the rain slash sideways across the empty bus station windows. Hurricane Delilah was bearing down on our little coastal town of Millbrook, and everyone with any sense had already evacuated. Everyone except me, apparently, because my family had forgotten I existed the moment they dropped me off with promises they never intended to keep. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. You might think you know where this story is going. You might think this is just another tale about ungrateful children and a forgotten mother. But let me tell you something, honey. Sometimes the biggest storms don't come from the sky. Sometimes they come from the people who are supposed to love you most. And sometimes, just sometimes, those storms reveal truths that change everything. What happened to me in that bus station over the next 5 days didn't just shake our little town to its foundation. It shook my entire family tree so hard that everything rotten fell right out of it. And when the dust settled, well, let's just say some people learned that karma doesn't just knock on your door. Sometimes she kicks it clean off its hinges. My name is Cheryl Patterson, and I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who'd find herself abandoned at a bus station during a hurricane. But life has a funny way of surprising you when you least expect it. 73 years of living had taught me many things, but apparently not enough to see through my own children's lies. The morning started like any other Tuesday in September. I was living in my modest little apartment on Maple Street, the one I'd called home for the past 15 years since Harold passed. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow that reminded me of sunflowers, and I'd filled every surface with photographs of my family, my 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren who barely knew my name. Those pictures smiled back at me every morning when I made my coffee, and I'd smile back, believing that all those faces represented people who loved me. How naive I was. The call came from my eldest, Michael, around 8 in the morning. His voice carried that tone he'd perfected over the years, the one that made him sound concerned while keeping enough distance to avoid any real responsibility. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, and I could hear his wife Diane's voice in the background, sharp and impatient as always. "This hurricane is going to be bad. Category 4, maybe 5. You can't stay in that apartment." I set down my coffee cup, the same blue ceramic one Harold had bought me for our 20th anniversary. "I'll be fine, sweetheart. This building has weathered plenty of storms." "Mom, no. We've all talked about it. Rebecca, David, and me. We're worried sick. You need to evacuate." My heart warmed at the thought that my children had been discussing my welfare. Rebecca lived 3 hours inland with her banker husband, safe from any hurricane's reach. David had moved to Atlanta years ago, climbing the corporate ladder at some insurance company. And Michael, my firstborn, lived right here in Millbrook in a beautiful colonial house on the hill, the one I'd helped him buy when he was struggling with his mortgage payments. "Well, I suppose I could come stay with you and Diane until it passes," I suggested, already mentally packing my overnight bag. The pause on the other end of the line lasted just a beat too long. "Mom, that's not. We're evacuating too. The whole Hill District is being cleared out, but we've got it all figured out. There's a bus leaving from the downtown station at noon going to the shelter in Riverside. We'll come pick you up afterward, once the storm passes." Something cold settled in my chest, but I pushed it away. My children were practical people, always had been. They'd learned it from their father, who approached every problem with logic and planning. Of course, they'd think of the most efficient solution. A shelter? "Michael, I've never stayed in a shelter in my life." "Mom, it's just for a few days, maybe a week at most. It's the smart thing to do. We'll all meet up there, the whole family. It'll be like a reunion." The way he said it, bright and cheerful, made it sound almost appealing. I pictured myself surrounded by my children and grandchildren, all of us riding out the storm together, sharing stories and playing cards like we used to do during the power outages when they were small. Will you be there? At the shelter? Another pause. We'll figure it out, Mom. The important thing is getting you somewhere safe. I should have pressed him for details. I should have asked more questions. But at 73, I'd gotten into the habit of trusting my children's judgment, especially when they all seemed to agree on something. They were successful adults with good jobs and nice houses. Surely they knew what was best. Michael arrived at 11:30 with his youngest son, Tyler, who was 16 and spending more time looking at his phone than helping his grandmother, with her suitcase. I'd packed carefully, my medications, enough clothes for a week, some photographs, and my jewelry box. Not because the pieces were particularly valuable, but because each one held a memory. The ride to the bus station was quiet except for the radio weather updates. Hurricane Delilah had strengthened overnight and was now packing winds of 160 miles per hour. The storm surge was expected to be catastrophic. I watched the familiar streets of Millbrook flash by, noting how many businesses had already boarded up their windows and how few cars were left on the roads. "Are you sure you'll be safe on the hill?" I asked Michael as we pulled up to the station. "Don't worry about us, Mom. Just focus on staying safe yourself." The bus station was a small, tired-looking building that served more as a Greyhound stop than a proper transportation hub. Only a handful of people waited inside, most of them elderly like myself, clutching small bags and wearing expressions of worry mixed with resignation. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, institutional glow. Michael walked me inside and spoke to the clerk, a young woman with kind eyes who assured him that the 12:15 bus to Riverside was still running, though it would likely be the last one before the storm hit. He bought my ticket and pressed it into my hand along with $40 in cash. "For food and whatever you need," he said, giving me a quick hug that felt more like an obligation than affection. "When will I see you again?" I asked, suddenly feeling like a child being dropped off at summer camp. "Soon, Mom. Real soon. As soon as the roads are clear." Tyler was already heading toward the door, eager to leave. Michael followed, pausing only to give me another quick wave before disappearing into the growing storm. I found a seat on one of the hard plastic chairs and settled in to wait, my suitcase at my feet and my purse clutched tightly in my lap. The rain had started in earnest now, drumming against the windows with increasing intensity. Through the glass, I could see palm trees beginning to bend and sway in ways that looked almost violent. 12:15 came and went. No bus. I approached the clerk, who looked up from her computer with apologetic eyes. "I'm sorry, ma'am. The 12:15 to Riverside has been canceled. Road conditions." "When's the next one?" She clicked through several screens, her expression growing more concerned. "The 2:30 is still showing, but honestly, I don't think it's going to run either. The state police are starting to close the highways." I returned to my seat, telling myself not to panic. Michael would figure something out. He always did. I tried calling him, but the call went straight to voicemail. I tried Rebecca and David, too, with the same result. Cell towers were probably overwhelmed with people trying to reach their families before the storm hit. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By 3 o'clock, it was clear that no buses were leaving Millbrook that day. The clerk had given up any pretense of normal operations and was packing up her things, preparing to leave herself. "Ma'am," she said, approaching me with genuine concern. "Do you have somewhere else you can go? We're closing the station." I tried calling Michael again. This time, miraculously, he answered on the 4th ring. "Mom, I can't really talk right now. We're in the middle of loading the car." "Michael, the buses aren't running. I'm still at the station." "What? But I bought you a ticket." The storm is too bad. They've canceled all the routes. I could hear him talking to someone in the background, his voice muffled as he covered the phone. When he came back, he sounded distracted and stressed. Okay, Mom, just stay there for now. Let me figure something out. The station is closing. The clerk is leaving. There's got to be somewhere you can wait, a restaurant or something. I looked around the empty station, then out at the storm that was now bending street signs and sending debris flying past the windows. Michael, everything is closed. The whole town is shutting down. Mom, I'm sorry, but we're literally walking out the door right now. Diane's parents are expecting us in Jacksonville, and if we don't leave now, we won't make it out before the worst of the storm hits. The words hit me like a physical blow. You're leaving? Without me? We thought you'd be on the bus by now. We thought you'd be safe. But I'm not on the bus. I'm here, and I have nowhere to go. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. When Michael spoke again, his voice carried an edge of irritation that cut through me like a knife. Mom, I don't know what you want me to do. We can't come back now. The roads are already getting dangerous. You're just going to have to find somewhere to ride it out. Michael, I'm 73 years old. I'm alone in a hurricane. This is your mother you're talking to. And you're a strong woman who's survived a lot worse than a storm. Look, I've got to go. Call Rebecca or David. Maybe one of them can help. The line went dead. I stared at my phone for a long moment, unable to process what had just happened. My eldest son, the one I'd rocked to sleep when he had nightmares, the one I'd sat up with during every fever and scraped knee, had just abandoned me in a hurricane because it was inconvenient to help. With shaking fingers, I dialed Rebecca's number. It rang and rang before going to voicemail. Same with David. I tried Michael again, but this time he didn't answer at all. The clerk approached me one more time, her expression a mixture of sympathy and helplessness. Ma'am, I really do have to lock up now. My supervisor is making everyone leave. I stood on unsteady legs, my suitcase feeling heavier than it had that morning. I understand, dear. Thank you for your kindness. She walked me to the door, her hand gentle on my arm. Is there someone coming for you? I looked out at the storm, at the empty streets and the debris already flying through the air, and realized that the answer was no. There was no one coming for me. The people who were supposed to love me most had decided I wasn't worth the inconvenience. I'll be fine, I told her, though we both knew it was a lie. She locked the door behind me, and I found myself standing alone under the small overhang of the bus station, watching Hurricane Delilah tear apart the only town I'd ever called home. The wind was so strong now that I had to brace myself against the building to keep from being knocked over. Rain drove at me from every direction, soaking through my coat within minutes. I thought about Harold, about how he would have moved heaven and earth to keep me safe. He would have driven through the hurricane himself before he'd leave me stranded, like this. The difference between the man I'd married and the children I'd raised was suddenly crystal clear, and it broke something inside me that I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. A piece of roofing metal went flying past, close enough that I could feel the wind it displaced. I realized I couldn't stay outside much longer. The storm was intensifying by the minute, and I needed shelter. Real shelter, not just the shallow overhang of a closed building. I started walking, my suitcase wheels catching on every piece of debris the wind had scattered across the sidewalk. Most of the buildings on Main Street were boarded up, but I could see light coming from Murphy's Diner about 2 blocks down. If Martha Murphy was still serving coffee, maybe she'd let an old woman wait out the storm. Each step was a battle against the wind. Twice I nearly lost my footing, and once a shopping bag filled with someone's belongings went tumbling past me like a tumbleweed. By the time I reached Murphy's, I was soaked to the skin and shivering uncontrollably. The diner was nearly empty except for 2 men at the counter and a family huddled in a corner booth. Martha looked up when I stumbled through the door, her weathered face immediately filling with concern. Cheryl Patterson, what in the world are you doing out in this storm? Martha and I had known each other for 20 years, ever since I'd started coming in for coffee after church on Sundays. She was a straight-talking woman who'd raised 5 children of her own and had opinions about everything from politics to pie crust. Right now, she looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "I was supposed to catch a bus," I said, water dripping from my coat onto her clean floor. "To the shelter in Riverside, but the buses stopped running." "Honey, they stopped running hours ago. Didn't your family know that?" I couldn't bring myself to tell her that my family knew exactly where I was and had chosen to leave anyway. Instead, I just nodded toward the corner. "Mind if I sit for a while? I'll buy coffee." Martha waved me toward a booth and brought me a towel and a steaming cup without being asked. "You can sit as long as you need to, but I'm closing in an hour. I've got to get home to my own family." I understood. Everyone had their own people to worry about. I was learning that the hard way. I tried calling my children again while I sat in that booth, listening to the storm get stronger outside. Michael's phone went straight to voicemail now. Rebecca's, too. David's number rang, but when someone finally answered, it was his wife, Patricia. "Oh, Cheryl, David's not available right now. We're dealing with some flooding in the basement." "Patricia, I need help. I'm stuck in Millbrook during the hurricane. The buses aren't running, and I don't have anywhere to go." "That's terrible, sweetie, but we're 3 states away. There's nothing we can do from here." "Can you try to reach Michael or Rebecca? Nobody's answering their phones." "I'm sure they're just busy with their own evacuations. You know how these things go." No, I was learning how these things went. I was learning that when push came to shove, I was on my own. "Patricia, I'm 73 years old, and I'm alone in a hurricane." "I'm sure you'll figure something out, Cheryl. You always do. Look, I really have to go deal with this water situation." She hung up, and I sat there staring at my phone, wondering when I'd become such an inconvenience to the people I'd spent my whole life putting first. When had their problems become more important than my safety? When had I become someone they could just leave behind? Martha came by to refill my coffee, and I could see the worry in her eyes. "Cheryl, honey, do you have somewhere to go when I close up?" I wanted to lie, to preserve what little dignity I had left, but the truth was too heavy to carry alone anymore. "No," I whispered. "I don't." She sat down across from me, her expression serious. "What about your kids? Michael lives right here in town." "They evacuated without me." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implications that neither of us wanted to examine too closely. Martha's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and finally, anger. "They what?" "Left for Jacksonville. Didn't want to be inconvenienced by having to change their plans." Martha's eyes blazed with the righteous fury that only a mother could muster. "That's the most shameful thing I've ever heard in my life. What kind of children leave their mother? In a hurricane?" I didn't have an answer for that because I was still trying to figure it out myself. I'd raised 3 children who'd all grown up to be successful, educated adults. I'd taught them right from wrong, love from selfishness, loyalty from convenience. Apparently, I hadn't taught them well enough. The lights flickered as another gust of wind shook the building. Through the windows, I could see that the storm was reaching its full fury now. Street signs were bent at impossible angles. And what? Looked like someone's patio furniture was tumbling end over end down Main Street. "Martha," I said quietly, "I think I need to call the police. Ask if there's an emergency shelter still open." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Let me try something first." Martha pulled out her phone and dialed a number, her fingers moving with the confidence of someone who'd memorized it long ago. After a few rings, someone answered. "Carlos, it's Martha Murphy. I know you're probably busy with the storm, but I've got a situation here at the diner." I could hear a man's voice on the other end, speaking in rapid Spanish mixed with English. Martha listened, nodding occasionally. "No, it's not structural damage," she said. "It's Cheryl Patterson. You remember Mrs. Patterson from church? Her family dropped her off at the bus station for evacuation, but the buses stopped running, and they left town without her." More conversation in Spanish, the tone growing more animated. I know. It's unbelievable. Can you help?" Martha listened for another moment, then smiled for the first time since I'd walked into her diner. "You're an angel, Carlos. We'll be here." She hung up and turned to me with relief written all over her face. "Carlos Mendoza is coming to get you. He owns the auto shop down on Commerce Street, and his family has a house about 5 miles inland. They're riding out the storm there." "I can't impose on strangers," I protested, though the relief flooding through me was overwhelming. "Honey, right now, strangers are treating you better than your own family. Besides, Carlos and his wife Elena have been members of St. Mary's for 15 years. I've known them since their oldest daughter was in diapers. They're good people." 20 minutes later, a pickup truck pulled up in front of the diner, fighting against the wind. A man about my age jumped out, wearing a rain slicker and a baseball cap that was immediately threatened by the storm. He jogged to the door, pushed it open against the wind, and stepped inside with a gust of rain. Carlos Mendoza was shorter than Harold had been, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He looked at me sitting in the booth, with my suitcase, and shook his head with what I recognized as a father's disappointment. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, his accent soft and warm. "Martha told me what happened. This is no good at all." "I don't want to be any trouble," I began, but he held up a hand. "No trouble. My Elena, she would box my ears if I left you here. We have plenty of room, plenty of food. You come with us, ride out the storm like family." The word family hit me harder than it should have. Here was a man I barely knew, offering me what my own children had refused to give: basic human decency in a time of crisis. Carlos helped me to his truck, holding my arm steady as we battled the wind. My suitcase went in the back, covered by a tarp he'd brought specifically for that purpose. The man had thought ahead, planned for my comfort, in ways my own son hadn't bothered to consider. As we drove through the storm-battered streets of Millbrook, Carlos kept up a steady stream of conversation, telling me about his family, his business, his plans to wait out the hurricane. His voice was calm and reassuring, the voice of someone who wasn't going to abandon me the moment things got difficult. "You know," he said as we turned onto a road I didn't recognize, "Elena and we've been through 4 hurricanes in this house. Built in 1987, good and strong. You'll be safe with us." I found myself crying then, not from fear of the storm, but from gratitude that such kindness existed in the world. That morning, I'd believed my family loved me. By evening, I'd learned that strangers could show more compassion than the children I'd carried in my womb. The Mendoza house sat on a small rise surrounded by old oak trees that bent in the wind but held their ground. Warm light glowed from every window, and I could see figures moving inside, a family preparing to weather the storm together. Carlos helped me up the front steps and through the door, where I was immediately enveloped in the warmth of a home filled with love. Elena Mendoza, a woman about my age with silver-streaked hair and laugh lines around her eyes, rushed forward to embrace me like I was her own mother. "Ay, pobrecita," she murmured, holding me tight. "Don't you worry about anything now. You're safe." Their 3 adult children were there with their own families, sons and daughters and grandchildren who'd all come to ride out Hurricane Delilah together. They made room for me at their table, shared their food, and treated me like I belonged. There. As the storm raged outside, shaking the house and rattling the windows, I sat in that warm living room surrounded by people who'd known me for all of 2 hours and felt more loved than I had in years. The Mendoza grandchildren played board games on the floor while the adults talked quietly, sharing stories and reassurances. Elena brought me a cup of tea and sat beside me on the couch. Carlos told me about your family, she said quietly. I cannot understand this. How do children do such a thing? I didn't have an answer for her either, but sitting there in the safety of her home, I realized that maybe I didn't need one. Maybe some people were just capable of love and others weren't. Maybe it had nothing to do with blood or obligation and everything to do with character. The power went out around midnight, but the Mendoza family was prepared. They had candles and flashlights, battery-powered radios, and plenty of blankets. We all settled in for a long night, listening to the storm tear at the house while staying warm and safe inside. I lay on the couch Elena had made up for me with soft sheets and extra pillows, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the difference between the family I'd been born into and the family I'd been adopted into by strangers. The blood relatives who'd thrown me away versus the people who'd taken me in without question. Somewhere out there in the storm, Hurricane Delilah was reshaping the landscape of our town. But inside the Mendoza house, another kind of storm was reshaping my understanding of what family really meant. And I had a feeling that when the winds died down and the sun came up, nothing would ever look the same again. The last thing I remembered before falling asleep was the sound of Carlos and Elena's voices in the kitchen, speaking quietly in Spanish. I caught enough words to understand they were talking about me, about how wrong it was for a mother to be abandoned by her children. Their anger on my behalf was like a warm blanket, protecting me from the cold truth of my situation. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, new understanding of just how far my family had fallen from grace. But tonight, I was safe in the house of strangers who'd proven themselves more worthy of the name family than the people who shared my DNA. Hurricane Delilah howled outside, tearing apart everything I'd thought I knew about love and loyalty. And in the morning, when the storm moved on, it would leave behind a landscape changed forever, including the landscape of my heart. I woke to the sound of gentle voices and the smell of fresh coffee, a stark contrast to the nightmare I'd lived through the day before. For a moment, I forgot where I was, reaching instinctively for Harold's side of the bed before reality crashed back over me like a cold wave. I wasn't in my sunny yellow apartment. I was on Elena Mendoza's couch, wrapped in blankets that smelled like lavender fabric softener, because my own children had left me to face Hurricane Delilah alone. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind an eerie quiet that felt almost unnatural after hours of howling wind. Through the living room windows, I could see the damage Delilah had left in her wake. Tree branches littered the yard, and what looked like someone's garbage can had come to rest against the Mendoza's front porch. But the house had held strong, just as Carlos promised it would. Elena appeared in the doorway carrying a steaming mug, her face creased with the kind of concern that should have come from my own daughter. "Buenos dias, Cheryl. How did you sleep?" "Better than I had any right to," I admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. It was strong and sweet, exactly the way Harold used to make it on Sunday mornings, when we'd sit on our little balcony and watch the world wake up. "The storm, she is finished," Elena said, settling into the armchair across from me. "But Carlos says the roads, they are very bad. Many trees down, flooding everywhere. It will be days before they clear the main highways." Days. The word settled, heavy in my chest as I realized what it meant. Even if my children suddenly developed consciences and decided to come back for me, they couldn't. I was stranded here with these kind strangers for the foreseeable future, completely dependent on their generosity. "I should try to call my insurance company," I said, thinking of my little apartment and wondering what condition it might be in. "See about my place." Elena's expression grew troubled. "Cheryl, Carlos drove by your street this morning, early, before the wind stopped completely. There is much damage there. Many buildings, they have lost their roofs." My heart sank as I pictured my cheerful yellow walls exposed to the elements, my photographs of smiling grandchildren soaked with rainwater. Everything I owned, Everything that connected me to the life I'd built with Harold might be gone. And for what? So my children could evacuate to Jacksonville without the inconvenience of bringing their mother along. But do not worry, Elena. Continued quickly, seeing the distress on my face. You stay here as long as you need. We have plenty of room, and honestly, it is nice to have another woman to talk to. These men, they think they know everything about hurricanes, but they never remember to stock enough toilet paper. Her gentle humor drew a smile from me despite everything. Here was a woman who'd taken in a stranger during a natural disaster and was somehow managing to make me feel like a welcome guest rather than a burden. The contrast to my own family's behavior was so stark, it made my chest ache. Carlos appeared, in the doorway, his hair still damp from a shower. Ladies, breakfast is ready. And Cheryl, I have news about the town. We gathered around the kitchen table, where the Mendoza family had laid out a feast that put my usual toast and coffee breakfast to shame. Fresh eggs from their neighbors' chickens, homemade tortillas, fruit salad, and bacon that smelled like heaven. Their adult children and grandchildren had already eaten and departed to check on their own properties, leaving the three of us to share the morning in comfortable quiet. "What's the news?" I asked, trying not to think about how long it had been since I'd shared a real breakfast with anyone. Carlos's expression grew serious as he buttered a tortilla. Downtown is very bad. The storm surge, it came further inland than anyone expected. Many businesses on Main Street, they are flooded. Murphy's Diner has 3 feet of water inside. My heart went out to Martha, who'd been so kind to me in my moment of need. Her little diner was her whole life, passed down from her father and the source of pride she'd carried for 30 years. "What about the residential areas?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Your neighborhood, it is not as bad as it could be. Some flooding, many trees down, but the buildings, most of them are still standing. But Cheryl," Carlos paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. "The Hill District where your son lives, they got hit very hard." "What do you mean, hit hard?" "Mudslides. All that rain on the steep slopes, it loosened the soil. Several houses, they slid right down the hill. Others have foundation damage, big cracks, not safe to live in." I set down, my coffee cup with shaking hands. Michael's beautiful colonial house, the one I'd helped him buy, was in the Hill District. Despite everything he'd done to me, he was still my son, and the thought of him losing his home filled me with complicated emotions. "Do you know which houses were affected?" Carlos shook his head. "The police, they are not letting anyone up there yet. Too dangerous. But I heard from my nephew who works for the fire department that Hilltop Drive got the worst of it." Hilltop Drive, Michael Street. I tried calling him immediately, but the call wouldn't go through. Cell service was still spotty throughout the area. Another reminder of how completely cut off I was from the people who were supposed to care about my welfare. "Try not to worry," Elena said, reaching across to pat my hand. "I am sure your family is safe. They evacuated, remember?" "Yes, they evacuated. They evacuated and left me behind, and now their fancy house on the hill might be sliding down into the valley." There was irony there, though I was too worried about their safety to fully appreciate it yet. After breakfast, Carlos offered to drive me to see my apartment. The roads were treacherous, littered with debris and standing water, but his pickup truck navigated the obstacles with the confidence of a vehicle that had seen many storms. As we drove through Millbrook, I got my first real look at what Hurricane Delilah had done to our little town. It was devastating. Entire sections of downtown were underwater, with boats that had broken free from the marina sitting in the middle of what used to be Commerce Street. The old courthouse, a building that had stood since 1923, was missing half its roof. Everywhere I looked, I saw the remnants of people's lives scattered by the wind. Children's toys, furniture, clothing, photographs that would never be the same even if their owners found them. My apartment building had fared better than I'd expected, though that wasn't saying much. The roof was mostly intact, but several windows had been blown out, and I could see water damage on the lower floors. My third-floor unit might have escaped the worst of it, but there was no power, no way to get inside to assess the real damage. It could be weeks before they restore utilities, Carlos said as we sat in his truck, staring up at the building. I'd called home for 15 years. Maybe months for some areas. Even if my apartment was livable, I couldn't stay there without electricity, without heat, without the basic necessities that made life bearable for a woman my age. I was truly homeless now, dependent on the kindness of people who'd known me for less than 24 hours. Carlos, I said quietly, I need to be honest with you about something. He turned to look at me, his expression patient and kind. I can pay you for letting me stay, for the food, for everything. I'm not as helpless as I might seem. His face darkened with something that looked like offense. Cheryl, you think we are taking you in for money? You think Elena cooks for you because we want to be paid? No, that's not what I meant. I don't want to be a burden. I have savings, investments. I can contribute. Carlos was quiet for a long moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. In my family, we do not charge money when someone needs help. This is not a hotel. This is not business. This is what people do for each other when the world goes crazy. I felt tears pricking at my eyes again, overwhelmed by the simple human decency that seemed to come so naturally to the Mendoza family. I'm not used to accepting charity. This is not charity. This is family. And you are family now, whether you like it or not. The word hit me like a physical blow, because it represented everything I'd thought I had, and everything I'd lost in the space of a single phone call. Family. The people who were supposed to show up when things got difficult, not run away to save themselves. We drove back to the Mendoza house in contemplative silence, past National Guard trucks and utility crews working to restore some semblance of normalcy to our battered town. The radio crackled with updates about the ongoing recovery effort, casualty, reports that thankfully remained low, and the massive economic impact the hurricane would have on our region. That last part caught my attention in a way it might not have before my abandonment. Economic impact, business losses, insurance claims, property damage. For the first time, I found myself wondering about my children's financial situation, not out of motherly concern, but out of something closer to curiosity. Michael worked in real estate development, a business that would be severely impacted by a disaster like this. Rebecca's husband was a banker, and I knew enough about economics to understand that natural disasters created chaos in financial markets. David's insurance company would be facing massive claims from hurricane damage. But these thoughts felt distant and abstract compared to the immediate reality of my situation. I was safe, fed, and cared for by people who owed me nothing. My children, wherever they were, had made their choices clear. That evening, the Mendoza family gathered again for dinner, their adult children returning with reports from around the region. The devastation was widespread, affecting not just our immediate area, but stretching inland for hundreds of miles. It would be the kind of disaster that reshapes communities, destroys some lives while revealing the true character of others. I helped Elena prepare the meal, grateful to have something useful to do with my hands. We worked together in comfortable rhythm, two women of a certain age who understood the therapeutic value of feeding people you care about. She told me stories about her children and grandchildren, about the hurricanes she'd weathered over the years, about the strength that comes from facing life's storms with people who love you. You know, she said, as we chopped vegetables for soup, Carlos and I, we were not born here. We came from El Salvador in 1981, during the Civil War. We had nothing but the clothes on our backs and two small children. That must have been terrifying, I said, thinking about the courage it took to start over in a foreign country. Yes, but also hopeful. Because we knew that in America, if you work hard and treat people right, you can build a good life. And we did. But the most important thing we learned is that family is not just blood. Family is the people who choose to love you, who choose to stay with you when things get hard. Her words settled deep in my chest, adding weight to thoughts I'd been trying to avoid. My blood family had chosen to leave me when things got inconvenient. This family had chosen to love me when I had nothing to offer but need. After dinner, we sat in the living room listening to the battery-powered radio, getting updates on the recovery effort. The newscaster's voice painted a picture of widespread destruction, billions of dollars in damages, communities that would take years to fully recover. Then came a segment that made me sit up straighter in my chair. In economic news, Hurricane Delilah is already having a significant impact on regional financial markets. Several major development projects along the Gulf Coast have been completely destroyed, and insurance companies are bracing for what could be the costliest natural disaster in the region's history. Banking institutions are reporting widespread disruptions to their operations, with many branches completely destroyed and computer systems offline indefinitely. Elena noticed my sudden attention. Something wrong, Cheryl? My son works in development. My son-in-law is a banker. My other son works for an insurance company. Carlos looked up from the book he'd been reading. All three of them in businesses that will be hit hard by this storm. Yes. We sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the implications. The children who'd abandoned me to save themselves might be facing financial ruin from the very storm they'd used as an excuse to leave me behind. Do you think they are okay? Elena asked. Not the money, but them, personally. It was a fair question, and one that revealed the difference between the woman I'd been 24 hours ago and the woman I was becoming. The old Cheryl would have been frantic with worry, calling everyone she knew to try to reach her children, consumed with maternal anxiety that overrode any other consideration. This new Cheryl felt something more complicated. Yes, I didn't want them to be hurt. They were still my children, still the babies I'd carried and raised and loved with everything in me. But I also felt a strange detachment, as if their welfare was no longer my primary responsibility. They'd made it clear that I wasn't their priority. Why should they be mine? I hope they're safe, I said finally. But they're adults. They made their choices. The next morning brought the first successful phone call I'd had since the storm. Not from any of my children, but from my insurance company. A cheerful representative named Jennifer explained that an adjuster would be out to assess my apartment sometime in the next 2 weeks, assuming they could get access to the building by then. In the meantime, Mrs. Patterson, I hope you have somewhere safe to stay. Do you have family in the area? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Did I have family in the area? My children lived here, but they'd made it clear I wasn't their problem. The Mendoza family had taken me in, but we shared no blood, no legal obligation, no history beyond a single act of kindness. Yes, I heard myself say. I'm staying with family. Because that's what they were, I realized. That's what they'd chosen to be, and what I was choosing to accept. Family by choice rather than chance, bound together by love rather than biology. After I hung up, Elena announced that she was going into town to check on some elderly neighbors, members of their church who lived alone and might need help. You want to come? She asked. It might be good to get out, see how everyone is doing. I agreed, grateful for something constructive to do. We loaded Elena's car with supplies, canned goods, water, flashlights, batteries, and set out to check on people who might have been forgotten in the chaos of recovery. Our first stop was Mrs. Rodriguez, an 80-year-old widow whose small house sat near the river. The flooding had reached her front porch, but the structure was sound. We found her sweeping mud from her living room, her face set in the determined expression of someone who'd survived worse things than hurricanes. Elena, gracias a Dios, she called when she saw us. I was wondering when someone would come. How are you managing, Isabel? Do you have food, water? I have some canned soup, but the stove, it does not work without electricity. And the water? It tastes strange. We helped her clean up the worst of the mud, shared our supplies, and made sure she had enough to last several more days. As we worked, Mrs. Rodriguez told us about the night of the storm, how she'd huddled in her bedroom closet listening to the wind try to tear her house apart. I kept thinking about my Pedro, she said, referring to her husband who'd passed 5 years earlier. Wondering if he was watching over me, keeping the roof on the house. I'm sure he was, Elena said gently. But you know what I kept thinking about most? My daughter in Tampa. She has not called, not once since the storm. She knows I live alone, knows I am old and need help, but nothing. Not even a text message to see if I am alive. The three of us exchanged glances, recognizing a familiar story. Another elderly mother, another ungrateful child who couldn't be bothered to check on their parent after a disaster. Some children, Elena said carefully, they get so busy with their own lives they forget what is important. Forget, Mrs. Rodriguez spat. My daughter did not forget. She just does not care. Just like her brother, just like all of them. They come around when they need money, but when I need help, nothing. Her words hit close to home, too close for comfort. How many elderly parents were sitting in damaged houses right now, waiting for children who would never come? How many of us had spent years investing in relationships that turned out to be entirely one-sided? Our next stop was Mr. Patterson, a retired teacher who lived in a small apartment complex near downtown. The building had lost most of its roof, and Mr. Patterson was staying in a Red Cross shelter that had been set up in the high school gymnasium. We found him there, sitting on a cot surrounded by a few salvaged possessions, looking lost and defeated. "Tom Patterson," Elena called out when she spotted him. "How are you holding up?" He looked up with eyes that seemed older than his 75 years. "Elena, good to see you. I'm making do, I suppose. Not much choice. Have you heard from your son? The one in Atlanta?" Mr. Patterson's expression darkened. "Oh, I heard from him. He called yesterday to tell me he can't help. Says he's got his own problems, what with the economy and his mortgage and all. Suggested I apply for assistance. From FEMA." FEMA? Government help for disaster victims. Can you imagine? 75 years old? And my own son wants me to go begging to the government instead of helping his father himself. Elena and I exchanged another look. The pattern was becoming clear, and it wasn't unique to my situation. All around us, elderly parents were discovering that the children they'd raised and sacrificed for were unwilling to return the favor when it mattered most. We spent the rest of the day visiting more neighbors, and the stories were depressingly similar. Mrs. Chen, whose daughter in California was too busy to help. Mr. Williams, whose 3 sons had all found excuses why they couldn't take him in. Mrs. Thompson, whose daughter had actually hung up on her when she called asking for a place to stay. By the time we returned to the Mendoza house that evening, I was overwhelmed by the scope of abandonment we'd witnessed. It wasn't just me. It was an entire generation of parents learning that their adult children viewed them as inconveniences, rather than responsibilities. "This is not normal," Elena said as we unloaded the car. "When I was young, families took care of each other. Grandparents lived with their children, helped raise the grandchildren. Everyone had a place, a purpose. Things are different now," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was making an excuse or stating a fact. Different, yes, but not better. These children, they think money is more important than family. They think their comfort is more important than their parents' safety. That night, as I lay on the couch that had become my refuge, I thought about the elderly people we'd visited. All of them abandoned in different ways. All of them discovering that the relationships they'd thought were solid were actually built on convenience and obligation rather than genuine love. But I also thought about the Mendoza family, about Elena and Carlos and their children who'd all shown up during the storm without being asked, about how they'd taken in a stranger and made her feel like she belonged, about the difference between families that were connected by DNA and families that were connected by choice. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, startling me out of my thoughts. For a moment, my heart leaped, thinking one of my children might finally be calling to check on me. But the number was unfamiliar, and when I answered, it was a woman's voice I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Sandra Mitchell from Channel 7 News. I'm calling because we're doing a story about Hurricane Delilah's impact on families, and your name came up as someone who might be willing to share their experience." "I'm sorry, how did you get my name?" "We've been interviewing people at various shelters and aid stations, and several people mentioned your situation, about how your family left you at the bus station during the evacuation." Heat flooded my cheeks as I realized that my abandonment had become public knowledge, something people were talking about around town. The shame was almost unbearable. "I don't think I'm interested in being on television," I said quickly. "Mrs. Patterson, I understand this is difficult, but your story is important. There are a lot of elderly people in similar situations, and bringing attention to the issue might help others." "Similar situations?" "Yes, we've documented dozens of cases just in our viewing area. Elderly parents abandoned by their adult children during the evacuation, left to fend for themselves during a Category 4 hurricane. It's become a significant story. Dozens of cases. I wasn't alone in this. I wasn't the only mother whose children had failed such a basic test of human decency." "I appreciate what you're trying to do," I told Sandra, "but I'm not ready to talk publicly about my family." "I understand, but Mrs. Patterson, if you change your mind, this story needs to be told. People need to know what's happening to our senior citizens when disaster strikes." After I hung up, I lay awake for a long time thinking about her words. This story needs to be told, as if my personal humiliation could serve some greater purpose, could somehow help other abandoned parents or shame other negligent children into doing better. But I wasn't ready for that level of exposure. I wasn't ready to become the poster child for family abandonment, to have my private pain dissected on the evening news. Some wounds were too fresh, too deep for public consumption. What I was ready for, though, was a new understanding of my place in the world. The Mendoza family had shown me what real love looked like, what genuine care and commitment meant. They demonstrated that family wasn't about blood or obligation, but about choice and character. My children had made their choice when they left me at that bus station. Now it was time for me to make mine. The next morning brought news that would change everything, though I didn't know it at the time. Carlos came in from his morning coffee, on the porch with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between concern and something that looked almost like satisfaction. "Cheryl," he said carefully, "I just got off the phone with my nephew at the fire department. They finally got access to the Hill District yesterday." My stomach clenched, preparing for bad news about Michael's house. "Your son's street, Hilltop Drive, it is very bad. 3 houses completely destroyed by mudslides, several more condemned as unsafe. The whole area is going to be evacuated indefinitely." "Which houses?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "I do not know specific addresses, but Miguel says, the damage gets worse the higher up the hill you go. The expensive houses, the ones with the best views, they got hit the hardest." Michael's house was at the very top of Hilltop Drive, the most expensive property on the most exclusive street in Millbrook. If the damage got worse higher up, then his beautiful colonial with its panoramic view of the valley was likely gone. Part of me felt a stab of genuine sorrow for his loss. That house had been his pride and joy, the symbol of his success and achievement. But another part of me, a part I wasn't entirely proud of, felt something else entirely. Justice, maybe. Irony, certainly. The very storm that had revealed his complete lack of character had also destroyed the material symbol of everything he thought was more important than his mother's welfare. I should try to call him, I said, reaching for my phone. Carlos held up a hand. Wait, there is more. I looked at him, noting the strange expression on his face. Miguel also told me something interesting about the evacuation, about the people who left town before the storm. What about them? Many of them, they are not coming back. What do you mean? Carlos sat down across from me, his expression growing more serious. The damage is so bad, the recovery will take years. People with money, people with options, they are deciding to start over somewhere else. Safer places, places without hurricanes. The implications hit me slowly. If Michael and his family weren't coming back, if they were relocating permanently to Jacksonville or wherever they'd gone, then they truly had left me behind in every sense of the word. Have you heard anything specific about my son's family? No, but Miguel says the insurance companies, they are already refusing to pay full claims. Something about flood damage not being covered by regular homeowners' policies. People are losing everything and getting only a fraction back from insurance. I absorbed this information in silence, trying to process what it might mean for my children's financial situations. Michael's real estate business would be decimated in a town that might take a decade to rebuild. Rebecca's husband's bank would be dealing with massive loan defaults and property devaluations. David's insurance company would be hemorrhaging money on claims while fighting to minimize payouts. The children who had abandoned me to preserve their comfortable lives might be discovering that comfort was more fragile than they'd imagined. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. This time it was a number I recognized. Rebecca. I stared at the screen for several rings, debating whether to answer. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let her experience the silence and uncertainty I'd lived with for days, but curiosity won out. Hello, Rebecca? Mom! Her voice was strained, higher pitched than usual. Thank God you're okay. I've been trying to reach you for days. The lie came so easily, so naturally, that it took my breath away. She hadn't been trying to reach me for days. If she had, she would have gotten through at some point, would have left voicemails, would have called the police to check on me. She was calling now for a reason that had nothing to do with maternal concern. I'm fine, I said simply. No thanks to any of you. There was a pause, and when Rebecca spoke again, her voice carried that tone she'd inherited from her father, the one that suggested I was being unreasonable. Mom, we explained this. We had to evacuate, and we thought you were safely on the bus to Riverside. How were we supposed to know the buses would stop running? You could have checked. You could have called. You could have come back when you realized I was stranded. The roads were closed, Mom. There was no way to get back into town. Another lie. The Mendoza family had stayed. Martha Murphy had stayed until the last possible moment. Plenty of people had found ways to help their loved ones without abandoning them entirely. What do you want, Rebecca? The bluntness of my question seemed to catch her off guard. In the old days, I would have danced around the issue, would have let her ease into whatever request she was preparing to make. But the old days were over, along with my willingness to make things comfortable for children who'd shown me no consideration. Mom, there's been some developments since the storm. Financial developments. Richard's bank, it's in serious trouble. The hurricane destroyed so many properties that a huge percentage of their loan portfolio is now worthless. They're talking about massive layoffs, maybe even closing some branches. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and meant it. I didn't wish financial hardship on anyone, even a son-in-law who'd participated in my abandonment. The thing is, we might lose the house. Our house, I mean. Richard's income was tied to commissions and bonuses, and if the bank fails... She trailed off, waiting for me to fill in the blanks, to offer the help she couldn't quite bring herself, to ask for directly. The old Cheryl would have jumped in immediately, would have started calculating how much I could afford to give them, how quickly I could liquidate investments to help my daughter through her crisis. This Cheryl waited. Mom, are you there? I'm here. I know this is a lot to ask, especially with everything that's happened, but we were wondering, hoping, if maybe you could help us through this rough patch. Just temporarily until things stabilize. There it was, the real reason for the call. Not concern for my welfare, not guilt over abandoning me, not even a proper apology for their behavior. They needed money, and they thought I was stupid enough or desperate enough to give it to them. Help you how? Well, we know you have some savings. Dad always said you were careful with money, that you had enough set aside for emergencies. This feels like an emergency. Harold had been careful with money, but not in the way Rebecca imagined. He'd been more than careful. He'd been brilliant and lucky and strategic in ways that our children had never fully understood. But that was information they'd forfeited the right to when they left me at a bus station in a hurricane. Rebecca, where are you now? We're still in Jacksonville, staying with Richard's sister. But Mom, we can't stay here indefinitely. We need to figure out our next steps. And that depends on whether we can count on family support. Family support. The phrase was so absurd I almost laughed out loud. They wanted family support from the family member they'd abandoned when she needed support. I see. And have you talked to your brothers about family support? Another pause. Michael's situation is even worse than ours. His entire business is gone, Mom. All those development projects he was working on, they're just gone. And his house, it's completely destroyed. They lost everything except what they could fit in their car when they evacuated. Despite everything, I felt a pang of genuine sympathy for Michael. Losing everything you'd worked for was devastating, regardless of what kind of person you were. What about David? David's company is hemorrhaging money on hurricane claims. They're talking about massive restructuring, potential bankruptcy. He might lose his job, his pension, everything. So all three of my children were facing financial ruin from the same storm they'd used as an excuse to abandon me. The irony was so perfect, it felt like divine intervention. That's terrible, I said. All of you struggling at the same time. Which is why we need to stick together as a family, Mom. We need to help each other through this. Help each other. As if abandoning me in a hurricane had been some kind of mutual aid project. Rebecca, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Of course. If I hadn't been stranded at the bus station, if I had made it safely to that shelter in Riverside, would you be calling me right now? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications neither of us wanted to examine too closely. Mom, what kind of question is that? A fair one. If your family hadn't lost everything in the hurricane, if you were still financially secure, would you have bothered to check on me at all? This isn't about money. Isn't it? You've been back in contact for all of 10 minutes, and you're already asking me to help you financially. You haven't asked how I survived the storm, where I've been staying, whether I'm hurt or scared or traumatized by what you did to me. The only thing you want to know is whether I can solve your money problems. Mom, you're being unfair. Am I? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like the only reason any of you remember I exist is when you need something from me. Rebecca's voice took on that wheedling tone she'd perfected as a teenager, the one that used to make me cave to whatever she wanted. Mom, we're family. Family helps family. That's what you always taught us. Yes, it is what I taught you. It's also what you forgot the moment it became inconvenient. I could hear her crying on the other end of the line, and despite everything, it tugged at my heart. She was still my daughter, still the little girl who used to crawl into my lap when she was scared. But she was also the woman who'd participated in leaving me to face a hurricane alone. Please, Mom, we don't have anywhere else to turn. You had somewhere to turn when you needed to evacuate. You had each other. You had Richard's family. You had options. I had nothing and no one, but somehow I survived. How? The question came out small and broken. How did you survive? For the first time since the call began, she sounded like she genuinely wanted to know. Like maybe, finally, she was beginning to understand the magnitude of what they'd done. Strangers helped me, I said simply. People who owed me nothing, who had their own families to worry about, took me in and treated me like I mattered. They fed me, sheltered me, made me feel safe when my own children couldn't be bothered to make sure I wasn't dead. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Mom," Rebecca finally whispered. "We're sorry. We're so sorry. We thought you'd be fine. We thought the buses would run, thought you'd be safe at the shelter, thought we'd pick you up in a few days and everything would go back to normal. But you didn't check. When your plans fell apart, when your assumptions proved wrong, you didn't check on me. You saved yourselves and hoped for the best regarding your mother. We were scared. The storm was so bad and we had the kids to think about and everything happened so fast." I was scared too, Rebecca. I was 73 years old, stranded in a hurricane with no idea if anyone in the world cared whether I lived or died. And the answer, as it turned out, was that my own children didn't care enough to find out. She was crying harder now, and part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her it was okay, to fall back into the pattern of prioritizing her feelings over my own pain. But I couldn't do it anymore. The woman who would have done that was gone, washed away in Hurricane Delilah, along with everything else I'd thought I could count on. "What can we do?" she asked. "How can we make this right?" It was a good question, one I'd been asking myself since the storm passed. How do you repair trust that's been shattered so completely? How do you rebuild a relationship with people who've shown you that your welfare means less to them than their convenience? "I don't know if you can," I said honestly. "I don't know if I can forgive this, Rebecca. I don't know if I should. But we're family." "Family," I repeated, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. "You keep using that word, Rebecca, but I don't think you understand what it means anymore. Family doesn't abandon each other when the going gets tough. Family doesn't disappear when someone needs help. Family shows up." The line went quiet except for her muffled sobs. I could picture her in Richard's sister's house, probably sitting at their kitchen table while her children played in the next room, completely unaware that their grandmother had almost died because their parents couldn't be bothered to ensure her safety. "I have to go," I said finally. "Mom, wait. Please don't hang up. We need to figure this out. What we need to figure out is whether there's anything left to salvage between us, and I'm not sure there is." I was experiencing the kind of love and support I'd spent decades giving to my children, but had never received in return. "There's something else," Carlos said, his tone growing more serious. "Miguel called me today with some specific information about your son's property on Hilltop Drive." I braced myself for whatever was coming. The mudslide didn't just destroy the house. It also revealed some problems with the foundation that suggest the original construction was not up to code. There are going to be lawsuits, investigations. Your son might be personally liable for damages to neighboring properties. The hits just kept coming. Michael wasn't just losing his home and his business. He was potentially facing legal action that could leave him in debt for the rest of his life. How did Miguel learn all this? His girlfriend works for the city inspector's office. The whole Hill district is going to be a legal nightmare for years. Property owners, contractors, insurance companies, the city itself, everyone suing everyone else. I thought about Michael's beautiful house, the one I'd helped him buy when he was struggling with his mortgage payments 15 years ago. He'd been so proud of that house, so pleased with himself for climbing high enough up the social ladder to afford a place on Hilltop Drive. Now that symbol of his success was going to destroy his future. My phone buzzed with a text message. Michael. Himself this time, not Rebecca. Mom, we need to talk. It's urgent. I stared at the message for a long moment, then set the phone aside without responding. Whatever urgency had prompted him to reach out, it could wait. I was tired of jumping every time one of my children decided they needed something from me. Cheryl? Elena's voice was gentle. You seem troubled. Michael wants to talk, says it's urgent. Do you want to call him back? The question forced me to examine my own feelings more carefully. Did I want to talk to Michael? Did I want to hear whatever crisis had prompted him to remember I existed? Did I want to open myself up to more manipulation and emotional blackmail? No, I said, surprised by the certainty in my voice. I don't. Carlos nodded approvingly. Good. Let him wait. Let him wonder. Maybe it will give him time to think about how he treated you. The next morning brought more phone calls. David this time, then Rebecca again, then Michael twice more. Each call went to voicemail, and each voicemail grew more desperate. Rebecca. Mom, please call me back. I know you're angry, but we really need to talk. Richard lost his job yesterday, and we have nowhere to go. David. Mom, it's David. I'm calling about the Patricia situation. My company is being investigated for fraud in handling hurricane claims. I might need a lawyer. Please call me back. Michael. Mom, this is serious. I'm not calling to ask for money. Well, I am. But it's not what you think. I'm in real trouble here. Legal trouble. Please just call me back. I listened to each message with Elena sitting beside me, her presence a steady comfort as I processed the escalating desperation in my children's voices. They weren't just facing financial hardship anymore. They were facing complete ruin, legal consequences, the destruction of everything they'd built their adult lives on. And despite everything they'd done to me, despite the abandonment and the callousness and the years of taking me for granted, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of cosmic justice. They were learning what it felt like to be powerless, to be scared, to need help and not know where to find it. They sound desperate, Elena observed. They are desperate. Their whole world is falling apart. How does that make you feel? It was a question I'd been avoiding asking myself. How did it make me feel to know that my children were suffering? That they were facing the loss of everything they'd worked for? That they were scared and desperate and turning to me as their last hope? Sad, I said finally. But not responsible. Elena smiled. That is wisdom, Cheryl. You can feel sad for someone without feeling obligated to fix their problems. They made choices, I continued, working through my thoughts out loud. They chose to prioritize their comfort over my safety. They chose to abandon me when I needed them most. They chose to build their lives on things that could be taken away. Now they're living with the consequences of those choices. And what about you? What choices will you make now? That was the million-dollar question, wasn't it? My children were in crisis, and despite everything they'd done, they were still my children. The old Cheryl would have rushed to help them, would have liquidated savings and investments to bail them out, would have sacrificed her own security to provide them with theirs. But the old Cheryl had died in Hurricane Delilah, abandoned at a bus station by the people she'd spent her life serving. This new version of myself had different priorities, different boundaries, different understanding of what family relationships should look like. My phone rang again. This time it was a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, it was Michael's voice. Mom, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for days. I know. I've been choosing not to answer. The bluntness of my response seemed to catch him off guard. Mom, we need to talk. In person if possible. Can I come see you? Come see me where, Michael? You left me stranded at a bus station, remember? You have no idea where I am or whether I'm safe. Jesus, Mom. I know we screwed up. I know we made terrible decisions, but I'm trying to make it right now. Are you? Or are you trying to get me to solve your problems? Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, more vulnerable than I'd heard it in years. Both, probably. I need help, Mom. Real help. And I know I don't deserve it after what we did, but I don't have anywhere else to turn. What kind of help? Financial help, legal help. The house is gone, the business is gone, and now there are lawsuits. Diane's family won't help us anymore. They say I brought this on myself by building in an unstable area, by cutting corners on construction. They're wrong, but I can't prove it without hiring lawyers I can't afford. Where are you staying? In our car, mostly. Sometimes in hotel. Rooms when we can afford them. The kids are staying with Diane's sister, but she says we can't. My grandson, Tyler, the 16-year-old who'd been so eager to escape my presence when Michael dropped me off, was now effectively homeless because his father had prioritized his own convenience over his mother's safety. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and meant it. Whatever Michael had done to me, his children didn't deserve to suffer for his failures. Mom, I know you have money set aside. Dad always said you were smart about investments, that you had more than enough for retirement. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a loan. Something to help us get back on our feet. Harold had indeed been smart about investments, smarter than any of our children had ever realized. But that was information I wasn't ready to share, especially not with a son who'd proven himself unworthy of my trust. Michael, let me ask you something. If none of this had happened, if the hurricane had never come, if your life was still perfect and mine was still small and manageable, would you be calling me right now? What do you mean? I mean, when was the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? When was the last time you invited me to dinner, or asked about my life, or showed any interest in me as a person, rather than as a source of babysitting or emergency funds? The silence stretched long enough that I knew he was really thinking about it, really examining our relationship from my perspective for perhaps the first time in his adult life. That's not fair, Mom. I've been busy building a business, raising kids, dealing with life. Too busy to check on your mother, too busy to include me in your family, too busy to make sure I was safe during a hurricane. But not too busy to ask for money when your carefully constructed life falls apart. Mom, please. I'm sorry. We're all sorry. We know we messed up, but this isn't about that anymore. This is about survival. No, Michael. This is exactly about that. This is about the fact that you only remember I exist when you need something from me. This is about the fact that you left me to die in a hurricane because it was inconvenient to help me. We didn't leave you to die. We thought you'd be safe at the shelter. You thought wrong, and when your assumptions proved incorrect, you didn't bother to check on me. You saved yourselves and hoped for the best regarding your mother. What do you want me to say? That I'm a terrible son? That I failed you? Fine, I admit it. I'm a terrible son who failed his mother when she needed me most. Is that what you want to hear? Actually, it was. For the first time in our conversation, Michael sounded like he understood the magnitude of what he'd done. He wasn't making excuses or deflecting blame. He was acknowledging the truth. It's a start, I said. So will you help us? I don't know yet. What do you mean, you don't know? I mean, I need time to think about it. Time to decide whether helping you is enabling your bad behavior or genuinely helping someone in need. Mom, we don't have time. The legal deadlines, the court dates, the bills that are due, everything is happening now. Then you should have thought about that before you abandoned me in a hurricane. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline of finally standing up to him. Elena appeared in the doorway, having obviously heard most of the conversation. How do you feel? She asked. Stronger, I said. surprised by the truth of it. I feel stronger. Good. You should feel strong. You are standing up for yourself for the first time. In years, maybe decades. That afternoon, I took a walk through the Mendoza's neighborhood with Sophia, who had appointed herself my guide to all the interesting sights within a few blocks of the house. She chattered constantly as we walked, pointing out her friends' houses, the good trees for climbing, the place where her cousin had crashed his bicycle and needed 3 stitches. "Abuela Cheryl," she said as we sat on a bench at the small neighborhood park, "why don't your children come to visit you?" It was an innocent question, asked with the straightforward curiosity that only children possess, but it cut right to the heart of everything I'd been struggling with. It's complicated, sweetheart. Sometimes families have problems that are hard to fix. But if they love you, wouldn't they want to see you? Out of the mouths of babes again. This 8-year-old had identified the central issue in one simple question. If my children loved me, really loved me, wouldn't they want to see me? Wouldn't they have made time for me in their lives? Wouldn't they have prioritized my safety over their convenience? You would think so, I said carefully. My mama says love isn't just feeling something in your heart. Love is what you do, how you treat people. She says you can't just say you love someone, you have to show them. Sophia's mother was clearly a wise woman. Love was indeed what you did, how you treated people. And by that standard, my children's love for me had been found severely wanting. That evening, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. I called my financial advisor. Harold and I had worked with the same investment firm for over 20 years, and our advisor, a woman named Patricia Williams, had guided us through market crashes and booms with steady wisdom. She'd been the one to help me navigate the financial aftermath of Harold's death, ensuring that I would be comfortable for the rest of my life. "Mrs. Patterson." Patricia's voice was warm with genuine pleasure. "I was just thinking about you. I heard about the hurricane and was worried about how you were doing." "I'm fine, Patricia. Better than fine, actually. But I need to discuss some changes to my portfolio." "Of course. What did you have in mind?" "I want to set up a trust, something that will ensure my money goes where I want it to go, when I want it to go there." "Are you thinking about estate planning? Because we've discussed that before, and your current will should cover most situations." "No, this is different. This is about making sure that the people who've shown me real kindness are taken care of, and that the people who've failed me understand there are consequences for their choices." Patricia was quiet for a moment, probably processing the implications of what I was saying. She'd known Harold and me for decades, had helped us plan for our children's education and our grandchildren's future. She'd never heard me speak this way about my family before. "Mrs. Patterson, are you sure about this? These kinds of decisions can be difficult to reverse, and family relationships can be complicated." "I'm very sure. My family relationships are indeed complicated, but they've become much clearer recently." We spent the next hour discussing the details of what I wanted to accomplish. Patricia was professional and thorough, asking all the right questions while carefully avoiding any judgment about my motivations. By the time we finished, I had a plan in place that would ensure my money went to people who deserved it rather than people who simply expected it. When I hung up, I felt lighter than I had in years. For decades, I'd carried the weight of responsibility for my children's happiness and success. I'd worried about their finances, their careers, their marriages, their problems. I'd been their safety net, their backup plan, their source of emergency funds and emotional support. No more. They were adults, and it was time for them to learn to stand on their own. The money I'd accumulated over a lifetime of careful living would go to people who'd shown me what real family looked like, who'd demonstrated love through actions rather than just words. The next morning brought another round of desperate phone calls from my children. This time I answered Rebecca's call. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said," she began without preamble. About how we abandoned you, about how strangers treated you better than your own family. You're right. We did abandon you, and it was inexcusable. Thank you for acknowledging that. But Mom, we're in real trouble here. Richard's not just unemployed. The bank is accusing him of hiding information about loan defaults, of not properly documenting property risks. He might face criminal charges. I'm sorry to hear that. We might lose everything: our house, our savings, Richard's pension, everything we've worked for our entire adult lives. That must be frightening. Rebecca seemed thrown by my calm responses, probably expecting more emotional engagement from me. Mom, we need help. Real help. We need money for lawyers, for living expenses, for getting back on our feet. I understand what you need, Rebecca. So will you help us? I'm considering it. What does that mean? It means I'm thinking about whether helping you financially would actually help you in the long run, or whether it would just enable you to continue making the same kinds of choices that got you into this situation. What kinds of choices? The choice to prioritize your comfort over other people's needs. The choice to abandon family members when helping them becomes inconvenient. The choice to only maintain relationships when they benefit you. Mom, that's not fair. We love you. Do you? Because love isn't just a feeling, Rebecca. Love is what you do, how you treat people. And by that standard, your love for me has been found wanting. We made a mistake. A terrible, horrible mistake. But people make mistakes, Mom. Good people make bad decisions sometimes. Yes, they do. But good people also face the consequences of those decisions. They don't expect other people to bail them out when their bad choices catch up with them. So you're not going to help us? I didn't say that. I said I'm considering it. And part of what I'm considering is whether you've learned anything from this experience, whether you're capable of growth and change, or whether you'll just repeat the same patterns if I remove the consequences of your actions. Rebecca was crying now, and despite everything, it tugged at my heart. She was still my daughter, still the little girl who used to run to me when she was hurt or scared. But she was also the woman who'd participated in leaving me to face a hurricane alone. What do we need to do? She asked through her tears. How can we prove to you that we've learned from this? It was a good question, one I'd been thinking about since Patricia and I had finished planning my trust. What would genuine repentance look like for my children? What would real change look like? I don't know yet, I said honestly. But I know that calling me only when you need money isn't it. We'll do anything, Mom. Anything you want. I don't want you to do anything for me, Rebecca. I want you to become the kind of people who wouldn't abandon their mother in a hurricane. I want you to develop the character your father and I tried to teach you when you were children. How do we do that? That's something you'll have to figure out for yourselves. Character can't be purchased or borrowed. It has to be built, one choice at a time. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen thinking about the conversation. For the first time since the hurricane, Rebecca had seemed to genuinely understand the magnitude of what they'd done to me. She'd acknowledged their abandonment without making excuses, had accepted responsibility for their choices. But I'd learned that acknowledgement and change were two different things. My children were very good at saying what they thought I wanted to hear when they needed something from me. The real test would be what they did when the crisis passed, when they no longer needed my help. Elena found me there an hour later, staring out the window at the garden she and Carlos had spent years cultivating. It was damaged from the storm, but already showing signs of recovery, new growth emerging from what had seemed like total destruction. "You look thoughtful," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "I've been thinking about second chances, about whether people can really change or whether they just say they can when it's convenient." "What do you think?" "I think some people can change, but only if they're forced to face real consequences for their actions. If you keep rescuing people from the results of their bad choices, they never learn to make better ones. Elena nodded. My mother used to say that the most loving thing you can do for someone sometimes is to let them fail. Let them learn what happens when they don't treat people right. It's hard, though. They're still my children. Of course it is hard. You are a good mother. Good mothers want to protect their children, even when those children are adults who should know better. But protecting them from consequences isn't really protecting them, is it? It's just enabling them to keep hurting people. Exactly. You cannot love someone into being a better person. They have to choose to become better themselves. That afternoon, Carlos returned from another trip into town with more news about the ongoing economic devastation. The situation was even worse than anyone had initially realized. The hurricane hadn't just damaged buildings and infrastructure. It had revealed systematic problems in the local economy, corruption in government agencies, fraud in financial institutions. Your son-in-law's bank, Carlos told me as we sat on the back porch. It was not just bad luck that got them in trouble. Miguel's friend who works for the state investigation unit says they were approving loans they knew were risky, hiding information from regulators, paying bonuses based on loan volume rather than loan quality. So Richard's troubles weren't just the result of hurricane damage. They were the result of years of poor business practices, of prioritizing short-term profits over long-term stability. Rebecca and Richard had built their comfortable lifestyle on a foundation of sand, and now the tide was coming in. What about the insurance companies? Same story, denying legitimate claims while approving excessive executive compensation, taking premium money and investing it in risky ventures instead of keeping reserves for disasters like this one. David's company wasn't just failing because of hurricane claims. It was failing because of fundamental dishonesty in how they'd conducted business for years. And the development projects? Carlos shook his head grimly. Your son's company was the worst of all. Building in areas they knew were unstable, using substandard materials, bribing inspectors to overlook code violations. The hurricane just exposed what was already rotten. Michael's business hadn't been destroyed by an act of nature. It had been built on corruption and corner-cutting, and the storm had simply revealed the truth about what he'd been doing for years. As I absorbed this information, I realized that my children's current crisis wasn't the result of bad luck or natural disaster. It was the inevitable consequence of years of making choices based on greed, convenience, and short-term thinking, rather than integrity, character, and long-term responsibility. They'd abandoned me during the hurricane for the same reason they were now facing financial and legal ruin. They'd consistently chosen the easy path over the right path, immediate gratification over lasting value, their own comfort over other people's welfare. The storm hadn't changed their character. It had revealed it. That evening, I made another phone call that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. I called the local television station and asked to speak with Sandra Mitchell, the reporter who'd contacted me about doing a story on families affected by the hurricane. Mrs. Patterson? Sandra's voice was surprised, but pleased. I was hoping I'd hear from you again. Are you ready to share your story? Yes, I said. I think I am. Sandra Mitchell arrived at the Mendoza house the next morning with a small crew and an energy that immediately put me at ease. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with intelligent eyes and a manner that suggested she genuinely cared about the stories she told, rather than just treating them as content to fill airtime. Mrs. Patterson, thank you so much for agreeing to this interview, she said as her cameraman set up equipment in Elena's living room. I know this can't be easy to talk about. It's not, I admitted. But I've realized that some stories need to be told, even when they're painful. We spent a few minutes going over what she wanted to cover, and I was impressed by her approach. She wasn't looking for sensational headlines or dramatic sound bites. She wanted to understand the broader pattern of what had happened during the hurricane, how many elderly people had been abandoned by their families, what it said about our society's treatment of aging parents, Before we start recording, Sandra said, I want you to know that several other families have come forward since I first called you. Your situation isn't unique, unfortunately. We've documented over 30 cases in our viewing area alone of elderly parents who were left behind during the evacuation. 30 cases. 30 other mothers and fathers who'd learned what I'd learned, that their children valued convenience more than their parents' lives. The number was staggering and heartbreaking. Are any of them willing to talk on camera? A few are, but many are still hoping their families will come back, still making excuses for what happened to them. You're one of the first to speak openly about what this kind of abandonment really means. When the camera started rolling, Sandra began, with gentle questions about my life before the hurricane, about my relationship with my children, about the morning they'd dropped me off at the bus station. I found myself speaking more honestly than I'd ever spoken to anyone outside the Mendoza family about what those relationships had really been like. Looking back now, Sandra asked, do you think there were warning signs that your children might abandon you during an emergency? It was a perceptive question, one that forced me to examine patterns I'd been ignoring for years. Yes, I said slowly. There were signs. They only called when they needed something. They rarely included me in family gatherings. When I did see them, I felt more like an obligation they were checking off a list than a person they genuinely wanted to spend time with. But you kept hoping things would change? I kept making excuses for them. I told myself they were busy, that adult children naturally become more independent, that I was being too needy or expecting too much. I convinced myself that their love was there even if they didn't show it very often. What changed your perspective? Being abandoned during a hurricane tends to clarify things, I said with a rueful smile. When your own children leave you to face a life-threatening storm alone, it becomes pretty clear what you actually mean to them. Sandra nodded sympathetically. Tell me about the family that took you in. This part was easier to talk about, filling me with warmth instead of pain. I told her about Carlos and Elena, about their kindness and generosity, about how they'd treated a stranger better than my own children had treated their mother. They showed me what real family looks like, I said. Family that shows up when you need them. That makes room at their table without being asked. That treats helping you as a privilege rather than a burden. Have your children tried to contact you since the storm? Oh, yes, I said, and couldn't help the bitter laugh that escaped. They've been very eager to contact me once their own situations became desperate. Sandra leaned forward slightly. What do you mean? All 3 of my children are now facing financial ruin because of the hurricane. The same storm that revealed their lack of character also destroyed their comfortable lives. Now, suddenly, they remember they have a mother, and they're very interested in whether I might be able to help them financially. How does that make you feel? Sad, I said honestly. Sad that it took a disaster for them to show me who they really are. Sad that they only think of me when they need something, but also clear about what needs to happen next. What's that? I looked directly into the camera, knowing that somewhere out there, other abandoned parents might be watching, might be struggling with the same questions I'd been wrestling with. I'm not going to enable their behavior anymore. I'm not going to rush to fix their problems or bail them out of the consequences of their own choices. They're adults, and it's time for them to learn what happens when you don't treat people right. Even though they're your children? Especially because they're my children. I raised them to be better than this. I taught them about kindness and responsibility and taking care of family. If I rescue them from the consequences of ignoring those lessons, I'm just teaching them that their actions don't matter, that someone else will always clean up their messes. After the interview, Sandra and I talked for another hour off camera. She told me about the other cases she'd documented, about elderly parents who'd been left in nursing homes during evacuations, about families who'd simply disappeared rather than deal with the inconvenience of including older relatives in their escape plans. There's something happening in our society, Sandra said as her crew packed up their equipment. Adult children seem to view their aging parents as burdens, rather than family members deserving of care and respect. I think it's because we've raised a generation that's never had to face real consequences for their actions, I replied. We've smoothed their paths, fixed their problems, given them everything they wanted without teaching them what they owed in return. Do you think it's too late to change that pattern? Not if people start speaking up about it. Not if abandoned parents stop making excuses for inexcusable behavior. Not if we start expecting better from our adult children instead of just accepting whatever scraps of attention they're willing to give us. That afternoon, my phone began ringing almost immediately after the news segment aired during the lunch. Our broadcast. The first call was from Michael, and his voice was tight with barely controlled anger. Mom, what the hell were you thinking? Going on television to air our family's private business? I was thinking that maybe other families need to hear this story. Maybe other parents need to know they're not alone in being abandoned by ungrateful children. You made us sound like monsters, like we deliberately set out to hurt you. Didn't you? You made a deliberate choice to leave me at that bus station. You made a deliberate choice not to check on me when your plans fell apart. You made a deliberate choice to prioritize your own comfort over my safety. It wasn't like that, and you know it. Then what was it like, Michael? Explain to me how abandoning your mother during a hurricane was actually an act of love. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, smaller somehow. We panicked, okay? The storm was getting worse, and Diane was freaking out about the kids, and everyone was saying we had to leave right then or we might not make it out. We thought you'd be fine at the shelter. We thought it would all work out. But when it didn't work out, when the buses stopped running and I was stranded, you still left town without me. The roads were already closing. If we'd tried to come back for you, we might have all been trapped. So you chose your safety over mine. We chose our children's safety over everything else. At least he was being honest now. They'd chosen their children's welfare over mine, their family's comfort over my survival. In their hierarchy of importance, I'd ranked below their convenience. I understand, I said. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. What does that mean? It means I'm done pretending that your neglect is normal or acceptable. I'm done making excuses for behavior that would be inexcusable from strangers, let alone from my own children. So you're going to punish us by humiliating us on television? I'm not punishing you, Michael. I'm telling the truth about what happened. If the truth is humiliating, that's something you need to deal with. Mom, we need your help. Not just money, though we need that too. We need you to stop this public campaign against us. Diane's family is already talking about cutting us off completely because of what you said on the news. So Diane's family, who'd already been questioning Michael's character, had seen the interview and drawn their own conclusions about the kind of man he was. Good for them. Maybe you should ask yourself why they're reacting that way, I suggested. Maybe the problem isn't that I told the truth, but that the truth reveals something about your character that people find troubling. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Seeing us suffer. The accusation stung because there was a grain of truth in it. I wasn't enjoying their suffering exactly, but I was experiencing a certain satisfaction in seeing them face consequences for their actions. For years, they'd treated me badly without any negative repercussions. Now, finally, their behavior was catching up with them. I'm not enjoying your suffering, Michael, but I'm not going to feel guilty about it either. You created this situation with your own choices. So you're really not going to help us? I didn't say that. I said I'm not going to enable your bad behavior. Those are two different things. What's the difference? The difference is that helping someone means giving them what they need to grow and improve. Enabling someone means giving them what they want so they don't have to change. I don't understand. I know you don't. That's part of the problem. That evening, Rebecca called while I was helping Elena prepare dinner. Her voice was shaky, and I could hear children crying in the background. Mom, I just saw the news interview. I can't believe you did that to us. I didn't do anything to you, Rebecca. I told the truth about what you did to me. But now everyone knows. Everyone in town is talking about it. Richard's sister is furious with us. She's saying we can't stay here anymore, that she won't enable people who abandon their parents. So Richard's sister had also drawn the appropriate conclusions about Rebecca and Richard's character. It seemed like the truth was having exactly the effect it should have. I'm sorry you're having to face consequences for your actions, said, though I wasn't sorry at all. That must be difficult. Mom, please, we need you to call the television station. Tell them you were upset and said things you didn't mean. We need you to fix this. Why would I do that? Because we're your children and we're in trouble, and that's what mothers do. They protect their children. Is it? Is that what children do for their mothers? Because when I was in trouble, when I needed protection and help and basic human decency, where were you? Rebecca was crying now, and despite everything, it affected me. She sounded lost and desperate and completely overwhelmed. But I'd learned to distinguish between feeling bad for someone and feeling responsible for fixing their problems. We made a mistake, she sobbed. A terrible, awful mistake. But we're paying for it now. We've lost everything, Mom. Everything. Yes, you have. And you lost it through your own choices, your own actions, your own values. The hurricane didn't. Take your integrity, Rebecca. You threw that away yourselves when you left me at that bus station. So you're just going to let us suffer? You're going to let your grandchildren be homeless because you want to teach us a lesson? The mention of my grandchildren hit home, as she'd known it would. Tyler and his younger sister hadn't chosen to abandon me. They were innocent victims of their parents' poor character and worse decisions. Your children are suffering because of choices you and their fathers made, I said carefully. Not because of anything I've done or failed to do. But you could help them. You could make sure they have a safe place to sleep, food to eat, a chance at a normal life. So could you, Rebecca. You could start making better choices. You could start treating people with kindness and respect. You could start building the kind of character that would make people want to help you. How do we do that? How do we prove to you that we've changed? It was the same question she'd asked before, and I still didn't have a complete answer. But I was beginning to understand what real change would look like. You start by taking responsibility for your actions without making excuses. You acknowledge that what you did was wrong, not just a mistake or poor timing, but a fundamental failure of character. Okay, we can do that. Then you demonstrate that acknowledgement through your behavior. You show me that you understand what family really means, what love really looks like, what responsibility really entails. How? That's something you'll have to figure out for yourselves. Character can't be coached or scripted. It has to come from inside you. After I hung up, Elena brought me a cup of tea and sat beside me on the couch where I'd been sleeping. For over a week now. That sounded difficult, she said. It was. They're really struggling, and part of me wants to just write them a check and make their problems go away. But I know that wouldn't really help them. It would just teach them that they can treat people badly without facing real consequences. Elena nodded. My mother used to say that the most loving thing you can do for someone who's making bad choices is to let them experience the full weight of those choices. It's hard, though, watching your children suffer, even when they've brought it on themselves. Of course it is hard. You are a good mother. Good mothers want to protect their children. But sometimes protection means letting them learn difficult lessons rather than shielding them from consequences. The next morning brought more phone calls from reporters who'd seen Sandra's interview and wanted to follow up on the story. Apparently, my situation had struck a nerve, resonating with viewers who'd experienced similar abandonment or who were horrified by the idea that adult children could be so callous toward their aging parents. I agreed to talk with a few more journalists, each time emphasizing the same points. This wasn't just about my family. This was about a broader pattern of adult children viewing their parents as inconveniences rather than family members deserving of care and respect. This was about the need for elderly people to stop making excuses for inexcusable behavior and start demanding better treatment from their families. By afternoon, my phone was ringing constantly. Some calls were from other abandoned parents who wanted to share their stories. Others were from adult children who'd recognized themselves in my description and wanted to apologize to their own neglected parents. A few were from people who were angry with me for airing dirty laundry in public, but even those calls suggested that the story was having an impact. The call that surprised me most came from a lawyer named James Morrison, who specialized in elder law and family legal issues. "Mrs. Patterson, I saw your interview yesterday, and I wanted to reach out because what happened to you represents a growing problem in our society. Adult children are increasingly abandoning their responsibilities to aging parents, and there are legal remedies available that most people don't know about." "What kind of legal remedies?" "Well, for starters, most states have filial responsibility laws that make adult children legally liable for their parents' care under certain circumstances. If your children have the means to help you but refuse to do so, they could potentially be held financially responsible for your welfare." This was news to me. I'd always assumed that once children reached adulthood, parents had no legal recourse for neglect or abandonment. But more importantly, James continued, there are ways to structure your estate and financial planning that can protect you from exploitation while ensuring that your assets go to people who've actually earned them through their care and attention. I've already started working on that with my financial advisor. Good for you. Too many elderly people continue to enable bad behavior because they feel guilty about setting boundaries with their adult children. But you have every right to leave your money to people who've treated you with love and respect, rather than to people who've treated you as an obligation. We talked for another 20 minutes about various legal options and protections available to elderly people dealing with family abandonment. By the time we finished, I had a much clearer understanding of my rights and options. That afternoon, David finally called. He'd been the most distant of my 3 children even before the hurricane, and I'd wondered when he'd join his siblings in their campaign for financial assistance. "Mom, I saw the news interview," he said without preamble. "I want you to know that I think what Michael and Rebecca did was inexcusable." This was unexpected. I'd been prepared for anger, defensiveness, or manipulation. I wasn't prepared for what sounded like genuine understanding and accountability. "Thank you for saying that, David. I should have said it sooner. I should have called you the moment I heard what happened. The fact that you were abandoned during a hurricane it's unforgivable." "Why didn't you call sooner?" David was quiet for a long moment. "Honestly, because I was dealing with my own crisis, and I didn't want to face how badly we'd all failed you. It was easier to pretend that everything was somehow okay, that you were fine and we hadn't really done anything that terrible." At least he was being honest about his motivations. "And what changed your mind?" "Seeing you on television, hearing you talk about what it felt like to be abandoned by your own children. It forced me to really think about what we'd done, not just to you, but to ourselves. We became the kind of people who abandon their mother during a natural disaster. That's not who I want to be." "So what do you want now, David?" "I want to apologize, sincerely, completely, without asking for anything in return. What we did to you was wrong, and I'm sorry." It was the first genuine apology I'd received from any of my children, the first acknowledgement that didn't come with conditions or requests for assistance. "I appreciate that, David. It means more than you know. I also want you to know that I'm not going to ask you for money or help with my situation. Patricia and I will figure out our problems ourselves. I don't deserve your help after what I participated in. What is your situation? The insurance company is being investigated for fraud, and I'll probably lose my job. Our retirement savings are tied up in company stock that's now worthless. We'll likely have to sell the house, start over financially. I'm sorry to hear that. It's the consequence of poor choices I made over many years. I built my career at a company that prioritized profits over people, that denied legitimate claims and exploited vulnerable customers. The hurricane just exposed what was already rotten. David's understanding of his situation was more mature than anything I'd heard from Michael or Rebecca. He wasn't blaming the hurricane or bad luck, or unfair treatment. He was acknowledging that his current problems were the result of choices he'd made. What will you do now? Start over. Find work that I can be proud of, even if it pays less. Try to become the kind of person Dad would have been proud of, the kind of person you raised me to be. And what about us? What about our relationship? I'd like to try to rebuild it, if you're willing. Not because I need anything from you, but because I miss having a relationship with my mother. I miss the woman who used to listen to my problems and give me advice and make me feel like I was loved no matter what. That woman is still here, David, but she's learned some hard lessons about boundaries and respect. I understand, and I'll accept whatever relationship you're willing to have with me. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't expect things to go back to the way they were. I just hope that maybe, over time, we can build something new. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time thinking about the difference between David's call and the conversations I'd had with Michael and Rebecca. David hadn't asked for anything. He'd taken responsibility without making excuses. He'd acknowledged that he needed to change rather than expecting me to change my expectations. It was the first conversation with one of my children since the hurricane that had given me any hope for the future of our relationship. That evening, Elena and I were preparing dinner when Carlos came home with yet more news about the ongoing investigation into local businesses and government agencies. The corruption runs deeper than anyone imagined, he said as he washed his hands at the kitchen sink. The mayor, half the city council, the building inspector, 3 bank presidents, and dozens of business owners are all facing criminal charges. What kind of charges? Bribery, fraud, conspiracy, money laundering. They were all working together to approve developments that should never have been built, to hide environmental hazards, to falsify safety inspections. So the destruction caused by Hurricane Delilah wasn't just the result of natural forces. It was the result of systematic corruption that had put profits ahead of safety, that had built homes and businesses in areas that were known to be dangerous. What about the people who invested in those developments? The ones who lost their money? Carlos's expression grew grim. They will get nothing back. The money is gone, hidden in offshore accounts or spent on luxury items that cannot be recovered. People who trusted these companies with their life savings, they are completely ruined. Michael's investors, the people who'd entrusted him with their money for his development projects, had lost everything because he'd been part of a corrupt system that prioritized short-term profits over long-term stability. His business hadn't been destroyed by bad luck. It had been destroyed because it was built on lies and illegal activities. Will there be prosecutions? Oh, yes. The FBI, the state attorney general, everyone is involved now. This will be the biggest corruption scandal in the state's history. What about the business owners who were involved? What happens to them? Prison, most likely. And they will have to pay restitution to their victims, though there is not enough money left to compensate everyone who was harmed. So Michael wasn't just facing financial ruin, he was potentially facing criminal charges and prison time. His abandonment of me during the hurricane was the least of his problems now. That night, as I lay on Elena's couch listening to the sounds of a house settling around a family that actually cared about each other, I thought about the cosmic justice of what was happening to my children. The storm that had revealed their lack of character had also destroyed the corrupt systems they'd built their lives on. Michael's real estate business had been built on bribes and code violations. Rebecca's husband's bank had been built on fraudulent lending practices. David's insurance company had been built on denying legitimate claims while enriching executives. None of them had lost their comfortable lives to bad luck or natural disaster. They'd lost them because they'd chosen to build those lives on foundations of dishonesty, greed, and exploitation. The hurricane had simply exposed what was already rotten. Meanwhile, I was sleeping safely in the home of people who'd built their lives on honesty, hard work, and genuine care for others. The Mendoza family had weathered the storm because their foundation was solid, because their relationships were real, because their values were strong enough to withstand any external pressure. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. Character mattered. Integrity mattered. The way you treated people mattered. And eventually, inevitably, those things determined not just what kind of person you were, but what kind of life you were able to build and maintain. My phone buzzed with a text message from Michael. "Mom, please call me. It's urgent. The FBI wants to talk to me tomorrow." I read the message twice, then deleted it without responding. Michael was finally facing the consequences of years of corrupt business practices, and he wanted me to rescue him from that reality. But rescuing him would just enable him to continue making the same kinds of choices that had led him to this point. Some lessons could only be learned the hard way. Some consequences couldn't be avoided or minimized. Some people needed to lose everything they'd built on lies before they could start building something real and lasting on truth. I turned off my phone and settled deeper into the blankets Elena had given me. Tomorrow would bring more desperate calls from my children, more attempts to manipulate me into fixing problems they'd created for themselves. But tonight, I was safe and warm in the home of people who'd chosen to love me, and that was enough. The storm had passed, but the reckoning was just beginning. And for the first time in years, I was exactly where I needed to be, with exactly the people who deserved my care and attention. The family I'd been born into had failed me, but the family I'd chosen was teaching me what love really looked like. It had taken a hurricane to show me the difference, but I was finally learning that blood didn't make family. Choice did. Character did. And the people who'd chosen to stand by me when I had nothing to offer but need were the people who deserved everything I had to give. 3 months after Hurricane Delilah changed everything, I stood in Patricia Williams' office signing the final documents that would ensure my legacy went to the people who truly deserved it. The trust was ironclad, carefully structured to protect both my interests and those of the Mendoza family who had shown me what genuine love looked like. "Are you absolutely certain about these arrangements, Mrs. Patterson?" Patricia asked one final time, her pen hovering over the signature page. "These decisions will be very difficult to reverse." I looked out her office window at the town that was slowly rebuilding itself, at the construction crews working to repair what the storm had damaged. Some buildings were being restored exactly as they'd been before. Others were being rebuilt stronger, with better foundations and materials that could withstand future storms. "I'm completely certain," I said, taking the pen from her hand. "I've learned the difference between enabling bad behavior and genuinely helping people I love." The trust I was establishing would provide handsomely for Elena and Carlos Mendoza, ensuring they could retire comfortably and that their children and grandchildren would have educational opportunities they might not otherwise afford. Sophia would have her college tuition paid for, along with veterinary school if she still wanted to pursue her dream of helping animals. There were provisions for other members of their extended family, for the church community that had embraced me, for several charities that helped elderly people in crisis situations. People who had shown kindness without expecting anything in return would be rewarded for their generosity. My biological children were not entirely excluded, but their inheritance was conditional. They would receive modest amounts only after demonstrating genuine change in their character and behavior over a period of years. The bulk of my estate would go to people who had earned it through their actions rather than their DNA. The legal language is very clear, Patricia explained as I signed each page. Your children cannot contest this arrangement successfully. You've been thoroughly evaluated by medical professionals. You've demonstrated complete mental competency, and you've had independent legal counsel review everything multiple times. I'd insisted on those safeguards because I knew Michael, Rebecca, and David would likely challenge the trust once they discovered its contents. They would claim I was mentally incompetent, emotionally manipulated, or unduly influenced by the Mendoza family. They would hire lawyers and fight for money they felt entitled to simply because they shared my blood. But blood alone didn't create entitlement. Character did. Actions did. Love demonstrated through behavior rather than just words did. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was sitting in a lawyer's office protecting myself from my own children while surrounded by people who'd never given me reason to doubt their motives. Elena had driven me to the appointment, waited patiently in the reception area, and would drive me home without asking a single question about my financial arrangements. She respected my privacy while offering her support, the perfect balance of care and boundaries. There's one more thing, I told Patricia as we finished with the main documents. I want to establish a scholarship fund at the local community college. Something for students who've overcome difficult family situations, who've had to build their own support systems because their biological families failed them. That's a beautiful idea. What would you like to call it? The Hurricane Survivors Scholarship. For people who've weathered storms that weren't just meteorological. Well, we spent another hour working out the details of the scholarship fund, creating criteria that would help young people who'd shown resilience and character despite difficult circumstances. Students who'd aged out of foster care, who'd been disowned by their families for being different, who'd overcome abuse or neglect to pursue education and better lives. When we finally finished, I felt lighter than I had in months. My money would go to people who would use it wisely, who would pass on the values of kindness and integrity to future generations. The legacy I left behind would reflect the lessons I'd learned rather than the mistakes I'd enabled. Elena was reading a magazine in the waiting room when I emerged from Patricia's office, but she looked up immediately with a warm smile that reminded me why I'd made the decisions I had. All finished? She asked, standing to give me the kind of gentle hug that had become second nature between us. All finished. Ready to go home? Home. I'd stopped thinking of my old apartment as home weeks ago. Home was wherever the Mendoza family was, wherever I felt valued and cared for and genuinely loved. Home was where people showed up for each other, where family meant something more than obligation and convenience. As we drove through town, I noticed how much progress had been made in rebuilding. Main Street was bustling again, though many of the businesses were different than before. Martha Murphy had reopened her diner in a new location with help from community fundraising and volunteers. The old courthouse was being restored with better safety features and modern accessibility. But some changes were permanent. The Hill district where Michael had lived remained largely empty, condemned by engineering reports that confirmed what the hurricane had revealed about unstable soil and substandard construction. A few houses had been demolished, their lots returned to nature rather than rebuilt with the same dangerous shortcuts. "Have you heard anything from your children lately?" Elena asked as we waited at a red light. "David calls once a week," I said. "He's working as a claims adjuster for a small, honest insurance company now, making a fraction of what he used to make, but he seems happier, more at peace with himself." David had been true to his word about not asking for financial help and focusing on rebuilding his character rather than his bank account. Our conversations were different now, more genuine, focused on real connection rather than superficial updates. He was slowly earning back my trust through consistent behavior rather than grand gestures. "What about the other two?" "Michael is in federal prison awaiting trial. Rebecca calls occasionally, usually when she's drunk and feeling sorry for herself. The FBI investigation had revealed the full extent of Michael's involvement in the corruption scandal. He'd been taking bribes for years, falsifying safety reports, and knowingly building in areas that were environmentally hazardous. When the hurricane exposed the fraud, it had taken down not just his business, but his freedom as well. Rebecca and Richard had moved to another state where Richard had found work as a bank teller, a significant step down from his previous executive position. They were living in a small apartment and struggling financially, but Rebecca seemed incapable of connecting their current hardships to their previous choices. "Do you think they'll ever really understand what they did wrong?" Elena asked. "Rebecca, probably not. She still sees herself as a victim of circumstances rather than the author of her own problems. Michael might eventually, if prison gives him time to really examine his life. David already does, which is why our relationship is slowly healing." We pulled into the driveway of the house that had become my sanctuary, where Sophia was waiting on the front porch with a drawing she'd made at school. "It was a picture of our family," she explained, showing all of us together under a rainbow that appeared after the storm passed. In her 8-year-old wisdom, she'd captured something essential about what we'd built together. "Abuela Cheryl, look, I drew all of us as a real family," she said, proudly displaying her artwork. "We are a real family, sweetheart. The realest family I've ever had." That evening, as had become our tradition, the extended Mendoza family gathered for dinner. Elena's children and their spouses, the grandchildren ranging in age from Sophia to teenagers starting college, Carlos's brother and his family who lived nearby. 23 people around tables that had been expanded to accommodate everyone, sharing food and stories and the kind of genuine affection that made every meal feel like a celebration. I helped Elena serve dessert, moving through the house, with the comfortable familiarity of someone who belonged there. Children called me Abuela Cheryl and brought me their homework to review. Teenagers asked my advice about college applications and career choices. Adults included me in conversations about everything from politics to recipes to family planning. This was what family was supposed to feel like. This was what I'd been missing for decades while convincing myself that obligation and duty were the same as love. After dinner, while the younger generation played games in the living room and the men argued good-naturedly about baseball on the back porch, Elena and I sat in the kitchen finishing the last of the dishes. "You seem peaceful tonight," she observed, watching me dry a casserole dish with careful attention. "I am peaceful. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." "No regrets about your children?" I considered the question carefully. Did I have regrets? Yes, but not the kind Elena was asking about. I regret that I didn't teach them better. I regret that I enabled their selfishness by always putting their needs ahead of my own. I regret that I wasted so many years hoping they would become people they were never going to become. But you don't regret setting boundaries with them now? Not at all. Setting boundaries was the most loving thing I could do, both for them and for myself. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone rang. Rebecca's number appeared on the screen, and I debated whether to answer. It was late for her to be calling, which usually meant she'd been drinking and was in one of her self-pitying moods. "Hello, Rebecca." "Mom." Her voice was slurred, confirming my suspicion about the drinking. "I've been thinking about that interview you did, about what you said on television." "What about it?" "You said we only called you when we needed something, that we never just called to check on you or see how you were doing." "That's true." "Well, I'm calling now, and I don't need anything. I just wanted to hear your voice." It was probably the alcohol talking, but there was something in her tone that sounded almost genuine. Almost like the daughter I remembered. From years ago, before life and disappointment and poor choices had hardened her into someone I barely recognized. "How are you doing, Rebecca?" "Honestly, terrible. Richard's working 60 hours a week just to pay rent on this awful apartment. The kids hate their new school. I can't find work because nobody wants to hire someone whose husband was involved in a banking scandal. I'm sorry things are difficult. But you know what's funny? Even though everything is falling apart, I think I'm starting to understand what you meant about consequences. This was new. Rebecca had never shown any insight into the connection between actions and outcomes, always viewing her problems as things that happened to her, rather than results of her own choices. What do you mean? I mean, we're poor now because Richard spent years taking money from people who couldn't afford to lose it. We're alone because we treated people badly when we thought we didn't need them. The kids are struggling because we taught them that money was more important than character. It was the most self-aware statement I'd ever heard from Rebecca, and it gave me a glimmer of hope that maybe, eventually, she might be capable of real growth. That's a hard realization to face. Yeah, it is. And you know what else is hard? Realizing that the mother I always thought was too soft, too giving, too naive, was actually the strongest person I knew. Her words brought tears to my eyes, not because they erased the pain of what she'd done, but because they suggested that maybe, someday, we might be able to build something real together. I love you, Rebecca. I've always loved you. But love doesn't mean accepting bad treatment or enabling destructive behavior. I'm starting to understand that. It's going to take me a while to become the kind of person who deserves your love, but I want to try. Then try. Not for me, but for yourself. Not to get something from me, but to become someone you can be proud of. After we hung up, I sat quietly in Elena's kitchen thinking about the conversation. It would be easy to get my hopes up, to believe that Rebecca was finally ready to change. But I'd learned to judge people by their actions over time, rather than their words in moments of crisis. Still, it was progress. The first time she'd called without asking for money, the first time she'd acknowledged her own role in creating her problems, the first time she'd seemed to understand that change had to come from within rather than from external rescue. Over the following weeks, Rebecca did continue calling regularly, just to talk. The conversations were often difficult, full of her struggles to adjust to a life without the comfort and status she'd always taken for granted. But she stopped asking for money, stopped expecting me to fix her problems, and started taking responsibility for the choices that had led to her current situation. David's weekly calls continued as well, and gradually I began to trust that his transformation was genuine, rather than temporary. He'd found work he could be proud of, was rebuilding his marriage on a foundation of honesty rather than material success, and was slowly learning to measure his worth by his character rather than his bank account. Michael's situation remained the most serious. Federal prison didn't allow for frequent phone calls, but the few letters I received from him suggested that he was finally facing the full weight of what he'd done. Not just to me, but to the investors who'd trusted him, the families who'd bought homes in his unsafe developments, the community that had been damaged by his corruption. His letters were different from his phone calls before his arrest. Instead of making excuses or blaming circumstances, he was taking responsibility for years of poor choices. Instead of asking for help, he was asking for forgiveness. Instead of demanding that I fix his problems, he was working to become someone worthy of a second chance. 6 months after the hurricane, Elena and Carlos officially invited me to move, in permanently rather than continuing as an extended guest. They'd renovated a small apartment above their garage, creating a private space that was entirely mine while keeping me close to the family that had become my anchor. Moving my belongings from storage felt like closing one chapter of my life and opening another. Most of my furniture and personal items had been damaged in the hurricane and subsequent flooding of my old apartment building. But the photographs that had survived told a different story now. Pictures of my children and grandchildren were mixed with new photos of the Mendoza family, of Sophia's school plays and birthday parties, of holiday celebrations where I was surrounded by people who actually wanted me there. The contrast was stark and telling. As I arranged my few remaining possessions in my new home, I thought about the woman I'd been before Hurricane Delilah. She'd been lonely without fully understanding why, desperate for connection with family members who viewed her as an obligation, generous to a fault with people who took her kindness for granted. That woman was gone, replaced by someone stronger and wiser and more selective about where she invested her emotional energy. I'd learned that saying no to people who treated you badly was actually saying yes to people who treated you well. I'd learned that family was something you built rather than something you were born into. The transformation hadn't been easy or painless, but it had been necessary. Sometimes it took a complete destruction of everything you thought you knew about your life to discover what was actually worth preserving and protecting. 1 year after the hurricane, Sandra Mitchell called to ask if I'd be willing to do a follow-up interview about how my life had changed since our first conversation. "I'd like to focus on the positive aspects of your story," she explained. "How you've rebuilt your life, the family you've found, the peace you've discovered. I think people need to hear that it's possible to start over, even at 73. I agreed to the interview, curious to reflect on how much had changed in 12 months. This time, we filmed in Elena's garden, which had been completely restored since the storm damage. The metaphor wasn't lost on either of us. "When we talked a year ago, you were angry and hurt and dealing with a devastating betrayal," Sandra began. "How would you describe your emotional state now?" "Grateful," I said without hesitation. "Grateful for the storm that showed me who people really were. Grateful for the family that took me in. Grateful for the opportunity to start over and build relationships based on genuine love rather than obligation." "Do you have any relationship with your biological children now?" "Yes, but very different relationships than before. David and I talk regularly, and I'm proud of the man he's becoming. Rebecca is slowly learning to take responsibility for her choices, and we're cautiously rebuilding trust. Michael is in prison, but his letters suggest he's finally understanding the connection between his actions and their consequences." "And your financial arrangements? Are you still planning to leave your estate to the family that took you in?" "Absolutely. My money will go to people who've earned it through their kindness and character. Blood doesn't create entitlement. Love does. Actions do. The Mendoza family has shown me what real family looks like, and they'll be rewarded for that." "What would you say to other elderly people who might be in similar situations with their adult children?" I looked directly into the camera, thinking about all the abandoned parents who might be watching, who might be making excuses for inexcusable behavior, who might be enabling their own mistreatment. Stop accepting bad treatment from people just because you're related to them. Stop making excuses for behavior that would be unacceptable from strangers. Start expecting your adult children to demonstrate the character you tried to teach them. And remember that saying no to people who treat you badly creates space in your life for people who will treat you well. Any final thoughts? Hurricane Delilah destroyed a lot of things in our community, but it also revealed what was built on solid foundations and what was built on lies. The same thing happened in my family relationships. The storm didn't create problems, it exposed them. And sometimes exposure is exactly what's needed to start building something better. After the interview aired, I received hundreds of letters from viewers who'd been inspired by my story. Elderly people who'd finally set boundaries with ungrateful children. Adult children who'd recognized themselves in my description and reached out to apologize to neglected parents. Families who'd used my experience as a catalyst for honest conversations about love, respect, and responsibility. The most meaningful letter came from a woman named Dorothy, whose daughter had left her in a nursing home during wildfire evacuations in California. "Your story gave me permission to stop making excuses for someone who doesn't deserve them," Dorothy wrote. "I've changed my will to leave my money to the nursing home staff who've shown me more kindness in 6 months than my daughter has shown me in 6 years. Thank you for showing me that family is about choice, not blood." 2 years after Hurricane Delilah, I stood in the Mendoza family kitchen preparing Thanksgiving dinner with Elena and her daughters, surrounded by the chatter of children and the warmth of people who'd chosen to love me. Sophia, now 10 and still determined to become a veterinarian, was helping me make pie crust while telling me about the injured bird she'd found at school. "Abuela Cheryl, do you think the bird will be okay?" she asked, her small hands carefully rolling dough under my guidance. "I think birds are stronger than people give them credit for," I told her. "Sometimes when they're hurt, they have to find new families, new flocks. But if they're smart and strong, they can build even better lives than they had before." She nodded seriously, understanding the metaphor in the way that children often do. Like you did. Like I did. Through the kitchen window, I could see Carlos and his sons setting up additional tables in the backyard to accommodate the 37 people who would be joining us for dinner. 3 generations of the Mendoza family, plus adopted members like me, plus friends who'd become family through choice rather than birth. My phone buzzed with a text message from David. "Happy Thanksgiving, Mom. Grateful for the second chance you've given me to earn your love." Rebecca had called that morning, sober and thoughtful, to tell me about the volunteer work she'd started doing at a homeless shelter. She was learning to find purpose in helping others, rather than in accumulating possessions, slowly becoming someone I could be proud of. Michael had written from prison to say that he'd been accepted into a program that would help him make financial restitution to his victims once he was released. He had years of incarceration ahead of him, but his letters suggested he was using that time to rebuild his character from the ground up. All 3 of my biological children were slowly learning the lessons I'd tried to teach them decades ago, but their education was coming through consequences rather than rescue, through facing the results of their choices rather than being shielded from them. And I was learning too. Learning that love without boundaries wasn't really love at all. Learning that enabling bad behavior was actually a form of cruelty. Learning that saying no to people who treated you badly was actually saying yes to people who treated you well. As dinner was served and 37 people gathered around tables laden with food and love, Carlos stood to offer the traditional blessing. But before he began, he looked at me with the kind of smile that made everything I'd been through worthwhile. "This year," he said, "we have extra reason to be grateful. We're thankful for family, both the family we're born into and the family we choose. We're thankful for storms that show us what's really important, and we're especially thankful for Cheryl, who taught us that love isn't about blood or obligation, but about showing up for each other when it matters most." As 36 voices echoed his words and raised their glasses in my honor, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from finally being exactly where you belong. Hurricane Delilah had taken away everything I thought I needed, but it had given me everything I actually wanted. Love, real family, people who chose to care about me not because they had to, but because they wanted to. People who showed up when things got difficult instead of disappearing when helping became inconvenient. The storm had passed, but the life I'd built in its aftermath was stronger than anything I'd had before. Because this time, I'd built it on foundations that could weather any storm. Character, integrity, and love demonstrated through actions, rather than just words. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.